pleasure this evening to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. Joseph G. Burke. Dr. Burke is a senior consultant and senior fellow at the Association of Governing Boards, and he was the president of KEYNOTE University in New York and is now president emeritus. During his 14-year presidential tenure, he led what is widely recognized as institutional transformation. He generated a complete renovation of the board in areas of strategic planning, presidential assessment, and entrepreneurial oversight. These innovations have led to the enhancement of academic excellence and achievement in fiscal stability. In other words, the kind of transformation that he led is the kind of thing that we're looking at in this year's theme, which is leadership and institutional resilience in difficult times. Dr. Burke has expanded his interest in international education, and he's served as a Middle East Fellow, and he's been sponsored by the American Professors for Peace in the Middle East. We're very pleased to welcome him here tonight, and he was awarded a prestigious Fulbright Scholarship for his work in Thailand. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker of the conference, Dr. Joseph G. Burke.
Thank you, Chris, and I welcome all of my distinguished colleagues on this particular opening panel. I would like to also say good day, whatever part of the day it is, to all those great star scholars around the world who are attending this conference. And I'd like to especially say thank you for the great research work you have done and you will continue to do on higher education. I'd also like to thank the administration, the faculty, and the staff of OP Jindal Global University for hosting this strategically important conference. We at the Association of Governing Boards in Washington, D.C. represent more than 1,300 of the world's leading universities and college governing boards. Our purpose is to improve the higher education leadership and governing capacity of governing boards, presidents, and administrations and overall higher education institutions. As such, we pay great attention to the educational research that you publish. We use it to educate our members to prepare them to lead their universities and colleges in meeting the challenges of the future. The purpose of my opening address today is threefold. First, to identify some important challenges and opportunities that present themselves to higher education leaders as they guide their institutions into the post-pandemic world. Secondly, to distinguish the specific topics where government and higher education leaders need your research assistance to better understand, illuminate, and clarify the future strategic choices and in ascertaining the best pathways and strategies to achieve success in the future. And third, to encourage greater collaboration between our educational research and leadership communities in identifying, addressing, and solving these key challenges for future generations of students. As the Vice Chancellor has said, COVID has been with us since early 2020. In that 24-month period, it has significantly impacted both worldwide and national societies, cultures, economies, political systems, and supporting educational systems, including what we are highly interested here today, our higher educational systems. It's also important to recognize just how closely these various social, cultural, political, and economic structures, processes, and outcomes are interrelated to each other, as well as to their supporting educational processes and outcomes. For instance, societies that are more open socially and politically generally possess more open higher educational systems and institutions. How the COVID pandemic impacts our higher education across the world has had both positive and negative impacts. There are too many of these impacts to adequately cover in this opening presentation, but I'm sure you're going to address them in greater details throughout this three-day meeting. Therefore, in the first part of my presentation, I will briefly address two obvious ones. That is, educational technology innovation, and financial resiliency. Both have received great attention from researchers, educational media, higher educational leaders, and government officials. Then I'd like to focus my remaining remarks on a third critical policy area, which is not receiving as much attention, yet might just be as important in the future. We see currently the presence of a lengthy COVID pandemic occurring simultaneously with expanding educational and informational and news delivery technologies and growing levels of economic disparity, all happening simultaneously across our world. The research question, I believe, of growing importance involves the interrelationship between these changing social conditions and the rising degree of worldwide political and social disruption and divisiveness. For education and governing leaders, this important research question is really twofold. What impacts do these social and political disruptions and divisiveness have on our educational systems and our students? And more importantly, what specific educational activities can our institutions conduct in order to minimize the growth of divisiveness within our societies, our citizens, and students that we serve? Let me repeat that because I think it's very important and it's not as widely apparent throughout the world. What impacts do the social and political disruptions and divisiveness have on our institutions and students? And more importantly, what specific educational activities, whether it's research, education, internships, cross-nation activities, can our institutions conduct in order to minimize the growth of divisiveness within the societies and citizens and students that we serve? I'll say more about this third outcome a little later in my presentation. Let's talk briefly about the COVID impact of technology on higher education. On the positive side, the pandemic has forced our entire international higher education system to quickly realign to the current public health crisis by rapidly adopting our educational systems. We sought ways to become more remote, basically, and isolated from human contact for the sake of health considerations. We've been able to achieve, through the creation of innovative educational technology delivery systems, some new and very rapidly changing educational systems around the world. These expanding educational technology delivery systems create the opportunity to provide higher education more conveniently, more cheaply, more remotely, and possibly more efficiently to more numerous populations in more remote areas. Yet it also presents us with a challenge to both governmental and educational leaders to ensure that all income groups can be assured access to the requirements. And I think the Vice Chancellor made this same comment: assured access to the requirements you need in this kind of environment. And that's the necessary technology, the necessary networks, and the bandwidth required to obtain more worldwide equity in educational products and services. Finally, it also presented an additional need for educational research on an international level, as technology itself gives us greater opportunity to deliver education more easily across national and international borders. Teachers must now be more knowledgeable, and the materials we use must be more sensitive to cross-cultural considerations. We need further testing to determine the best and most cost-effective teaching and learning technologies across cultures and across nations. More research is still needed just in the technology areas alone. But I want to move to a second area, and that is to talk briefly about the second COVID impact area, and that is financial resiliency and sustainability. The pandemic quickly led to a rapid shutdown of our traditional campus operations. The required community health initiatives dramatically impacted our traditional campus revenue sources and resulted in significant operational budget deficits. In cases where these deficits were not reimbursed by federal and/or state emergency funding, this quickly demonstrated the widely differing financial fragility and resiliency and lack of campus surplus and reserves maintained by many of our higher education institutions and systems. It pointed out how close to the sustainability level many of our institutions were operating and demonstrated a need for greater innovation and resilience across the higher education sector. This seems to be a common theme across nations and cultures. In most countries of the world, there are relatively few well-endowed institutions, and many more dealing with financial sustainability challenges. The pandemic made this gap more apparent and forced many institutions to change at a faster pace or risk closure. We at AGB are getting many more requests for consulting assistance in the creation of new and more innovative institutional, strategic, and financial planning processes. We have seen growing new institutional financial strategies with an emphasis on mergers and consolidation of everything from back office support and back office functions to almost entire organizational structures. Here is another way where educational research is greatly needed by our leadership to help identify new strategic financial pathways through the use of innovation and resilience strategies, which are essential for the future. These areas of technology, innovation, resilience, and sustainability are today generating more attention in the educational media and are receiving a great deal of focus in the research area as well. And I thank you for what you're doing. In fact, we at AGB are getting most of our requests for information and consulting services within these two areas. But there is a much more we could say about the impacts of COVID on these specific areas. However, my time is limited and I will turn to my final area of emphasis. One that is not receiving the level of attention that it warrants. In essence, it has been created by an emerging close interrelationship of the COVID pandemic operating closely with the existing economic inequality across the countries in the world and rapidly expanding education and information technology delivery systems where people know more about what's happening throughout their countries in the world. It is also impacting our educational systems, and it is in my belief that it can also be used to minimize by the contributions of our educational system these kinds of things, especially by higher education research and leadership. The condition that our world is currently experiencing can be summarized as follows. A significant rise in the combination of negative societal characteristics, including fear, self-centeredness, tribalism, extreme nationalism, and increasing political and social upheaval and divisiveness. These undesirable and damaging traits appear to be increasing worldwide phenomena. COVID has been only a partial contributor, but certainly not the only contributor. Governmental leaders are growing increasingly concerned by the longer-term impacts of this social and political divisiveness and disruption. They are seeking better understanding of the causes. Educational governance and administrative leaders are seeking to better understand two phenomena. What impacts will this growing divisiveness have on their institutions? And what contribution can the higher education sector in general and their institutions specifically have on alleviating the level of disruption and social and political divisiveness on the social and higher education institutions we serve? Fear is a significant influencer in this interrelationship. Fear of the unknown, fear of the pandemic, fear of the future, fear of international travel and exposure during a pandemic are all due to valid health considerations of the COVID pandemic. COVID has also encouraged countries to become more inward-looking and more fearful of outsiders. The fear generated by the pandemic has encouraged the development of a we, them, tribalist tendency, and the growth of a greater sense of concern of individual small groups, families, and tribes. These concerns have all led to greater expressions of intolerance and political, social, culture, and ethnic divisive rises. The exact interrelationship between the pandemic, emerging technologies, economic inequality, and facilitated educational levels are all suspect as political influencers, but our campus and governmental leaders dispute the exact relationships. However, it's far easier to witness the collective results. We see more political extremism, less political compromise, and more public civil disruption within both the domestic and international levels. More research is needed to assist our campus and governmental leaders in developing short and long-term attention, and thank you for attending this conference.